Okay, and we can officially start and we'll continue. So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have everybody here today. I'm Christian Harrison, and I'm privileged to be the facilitator of the research seminars series of the Business School, or the School of Business and Creative Industries of the University of the West of Scotland. We've had this seminars running for the last couple of months, and we've had great seminars looking at different perspectives to management and business and different things as well. But today we'll be having a very, very apt seminar, no pressure. We have an expert in the house today, and he will be telling us much more about food supply chains, especially within the disadvantaged communities in the UK. But before we introduce our guest speaker today, I'd like to tell everybody thank you for coming. Thanks for supporting the research seminars of our school. And on behalf of our Dean, Professor Dominic Elliott, I'd like to welcome all of you here today. And like I always say, please feel free to use the chat box and use it to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're coming from. We have some people coming from the States, like Nicolo. So tell us where you're coming from. Tell us who you are. So you feel free to use the chat box. I know, of course, a lot of people prefer to put their cameras off, but it's always great to see a place, a face to the name. So don't be shy, or don't feel like you're not. You can put your camera on if you want to, but of course, if you don't want to as well, I'm happy for you to leave your cameras off. So it's great either way. And the rules of Zoom, please, if you're not talking, try to mute yourself. I think we're used to this by now. Try to mute yourself if you're not talking. And most importantly, it's not a do or die affair. So if there is a fire alarm in your house, please, you can run away, and you're free to take a drink or something, water, because this is online. So please feel free to do that. I always tell people, so while introducing yourself, you can be creative about it. You don't need to introduce yourself in English. I've had people in the past that have introduced themselves in Mandarin, in Yoruba. I don't know what's called in Ghana, but you can use your native language and try to introduce yourself in the chat. Just getting to know you, but let us know where you're coming from, and at least that would keep the engagement going. But today really is not about, it's about much more, and we're looking at, like I said, trying to look at mapping the food supply chain for disadvantaged communities in the UK. As you can see, with the cost of inflation crisis, with Brexit, there is so much happening in the world today. And it has become our time, it has become very essential that we look at how we can manage the food supply chain, especially within communities. When you go to the grocery stores, you see that things have increased, things are changing, the cost is no longer the same. But how can we manage the food supply chains? How can we ensure that we are able to map it based on the available data in the house? We will be looking at that today, and that's why we have a renowned speaker, Dr. Emmanuel Sawyerr, who will be providing more light to that. When I approached Emmanuel about it, I told Emmanuel that please, we want you to be here today, and he told me yes, he was going to be here. So he said no matter what, he was going to make it happen. I'm so glad that he agreed. I think the first time I had that discussion when we were in London, and I just put it out there, and he said yes. So thank you so much, Emmanuel, for getting this done. But who is Emmanuel? I would just say one or two words about Emmanuel, and before don't worry, I stole your bio, Emmanuel, so don't be scared. Either way, so Emmanuel, his expertise is in supply chain resilience, procurement, supply chain excellence in developing countries, and sustainable supply chain management and food supply chains. So that is where his expertise lies. He had his PhD at the Westminster Business School, University of Westminster, London. So he's an English person. That's where he did his PhD. And he has lectured in undergrad programs and postgraduate programs on sustainable growth, global growth, sustainable business operations management within that space. Currently, Emmanuel is a research fellow in the Center for Logistics, Procurement and Supply Chain Management at Cranfield University School of Management, where he's providing his supply chain expertise on several big projects. And one thing about Emmanuel, he's well published. He has published quite a great number of articles in high-ranking journals. And that's been a privilege, of course, to work with Emmanuel in publishing some of these papers as well. So with I don't want to talk so much, and just to get straight to the point, I will like to introduce Emmanuel to start the seminar, and Emmanuel will be talking about mapping the food supply chain for disadvantaged communities in the UK. So thanks, Dr. Sawyerr, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harrison. I hope I can be heard.
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent, excellent. So when I was given the opportunity to go through or speak or present some of my research, I did find it quite interesting. I was quite excited about it. And I was wondering which of the research work that I was doing that would be interesting to present. But ultimately, I settled on this one because I think that it's very timely and quite relevant to us. And considering everything that is happening, like Christian said, and quite a few more of us are shifting into communities that could be called disadvantaged because of struggling with access to food and all of that. So I think it'll be interesting to look at how that supply chain looks like, how it works like, and what the issues therein might be. This project that I'm going to present on is work I'm working with Professor Michael Bollockis here in Cranfield. And we'll be looking at the processes involved in that supply chain, which is quite a unique one, the challenges therein, and potential solutions that may be explored. I'll try as much as possible to get through with it in good time so that we may have enough time to engage. Christian has done most of the introduction, so I wouldn't repeat much of it, but I did want to mention that I am a former student and alumni of UWS. So it's nice coming back home to do some work and present some of my research. And my research interests too are noted there again, as Christian had already pointed out. Now, getting straight into it, this research that we are doing is part of an overall project called Food Systems Equality Project, which is one of the 4 major consortia that are sponsored under the Transforming UK Food Systems funding or program that is currently ongoing. And for us in particular, with what's the name? For us in Food Sequel, we are focusing on how to make the community the center of everything. So how do we ensure that people who may be considered disadvantaged, and here our definition of disadvantage is quite broad. So we are looking at people who may not be able to eat healthily and may struggle with access, either financial accessibility or actually physical accessibility to food, may not have the resources to cook and all of that. We put them at the center of the community, and how to engage with all the relevant stakeholders within the community to ensure that they have access to healthy, sustainable, affordable, and attractive food options, right? And we're hoping to do that through co-production, and where we are working together with the community and with the relevant people within the food supply chain to develop new products, new supply chains, and perhaps even more importantly, policy frameworks that will facilitate this process. Within the UK, we are focusing on 4 particular communities: Tower Hamlets, Brighton and Hove, Plymouth, and then Whitley in Reading. So at the start of the project, before we even went into these 4 communities, we thought it important to do a national level work where we look at the generic access to food within the food supply chain by disadvantaged communities without preempting, how it's supposed to be. So we didn't even decide to go speak to food banks or anything of that nature. We wanted to speak to the actors themselves. And I'll later on discuss some of our methodology on that side. But from a theoretical perspective, we wanted to approach things from a transformative supply chain research perspective. And the idea of transformative supply chain research, it's borrowed from originally the transformative consumer research, which started when David Glenmake, who was the president of the Consumer Research Group in the US, somewhere around 2006, engage with their discipline to think about how they could make the consumer the focus of their research in addressing issues around vulnerable consumer groups, nutrition and obesity, financial and medical decision-making and stuff like that. And ultimately, the goal was to ensure methodological rigorousness, which would both inform theory, but also perhaps even more importantly, contribute to the well-being of individuals and communities. Now, years later, this was also introduced into service research. So it was identified as transformative service research by Laurel Anderson, who talked about investigating the relationship between the service that is provided to customers and their well-being. So the focus here was ensuring to uplift the lives of individuals, both consumers and employees, families and communities, and indeed the overall ecosystem. The indicators of well-being in this context was highlighted as mental health, physical health, issues around discrimination, literacy, inclusion, marginalization, and capacity building, and all of these issues that are quite relevant in the society. Subsequently, we have had to think about things within the supply chain research from this perspective, right? Intrinsically, supply chain research has always been viewed as delivering value to the end consumer in the form of products and services. So supply chain by itself looks at the customer and delivering value to the customer. And we also understand that an effective management of the supply chain will necessarily lead to a superior value creation for the customer, both in terms of customer satisfaction and customer retention for businesses. Now, I think that when COVID-19 happened, another aspect of supply chain management was highlighted to us that for quite some time we may have been overlooking. And that is the value that proper supply chain management creates to the individuals and communities in terms of their well-being, right? So when the supply chains were struggling, we could see the effects on people who were then lacking access to certain needs that they really needed, and the role that proper management could play in meeting those needs so that their well-being could be improved. And so any research that seeks to investigate the management of supply chains to ensure or address the well-being of consumers and the community in general is what will be referred to as transformative supply chain research. And so for this research that we are doing, we are looking at it from the perspective of the consumers. And as we pointed out, the disadvantaged communities. Of course, as every supply chain is managed, we are hoping to ensure economic viability, proper efficiency, and all of that, but also at the same time to ensure that our consumers that we are looking at have their well-being in check. They have good access to good food and are able to eat healthily and properly, eating choice foods and not just anything that may be forced down their throat. Now, properly situating the context of our research, 1 trillion worth of food go to waste annually, all right? And a couple of years ago, this was before COVID, right? So this is not even post-COVID, because then we would have accused COVID, as it were, of being the cause of it. But in 2019, almost 2 billion people did not have access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. So that is on the global scale. But when you come to the UK, things are not necessarily better, even though we are a very developed country. All right, 22% of the population live in poverty, with 10 million living in food deserts, about 10.2 of which live in deprived communities. And again, relying on data pre-COVID, because it puts things into context and does not let us blame COVID for it. Almost 300% increase in the reliance on food banks within the UK. So it highlights the issue of food insecurity. And like we all are aware, with COVID-19 and the Ukraine war and all of those things, the situation has gotten worse. So it makes it important to look at it. Meanwhile, we look at this report from the BBC a couple of years ago.
Food waste. Hundreds of tons of it here at the largest food collection site in London.
Can you hear the audio?
Yet this isn't even 1% of what we waste on a daily basis. Well, this is the latest delivery they've had here. This is about 6 tons of food waste. They'll get 30 deliveries just like this one every single day. And admittedly, a lot of the food is rotten and really smells bad. But some of this food actually looks okay to eat.
So as you can see from this video, there is still good food that is getting thrown away, right? Even though we have a situation within the UK where millions are struggling to have access to good, nutritious food. That takes us then to look at the food and drink waste hierarchy. Now, in 2014, Papadopoulos and co-authors actually worked on and prescribed, co-opted essentially the waste management hierarchy and brought it into food management, and we introduced the food and drink waste hierarchy, which the UK government has co-opted and revised to make it look a little bit nicer, and various steps in there. And you can see here that ultimately we are interested in preventing food waste, but if we are unable to prevent it, the next step is to make sure that we redistribute that for human consumption. And beyond, once we have satisfied the human need, the remaining is then sent on for animal feed, biomaterial processing, then on to anaerobic digestion, composting, and all the way until the very least that may be left, if there is any left, may be then sent to landfills and places like that. But our research here is more interested in focusing on the redistribution to people, because we realize that we have a need and there is some surplus that we have in our system that needs to get to human beings to consume. So the UK has already started and made several interventions on this front. And you can see a pale picture of Rashford there in the background and his intervention in the school feeding issues. But that's just an example. There are multiple food banks within the country. The Sustainable Food Cities program has had many food partnerships crop up in many cities within the UK, Brighton and Hove Food Partnership, Food Plymouth, and multiple others. Free school meals, like I pointed out, and Russia's intervention with the Prime Minister a couple of years ago, and holiday activities and food programs and all of that. Notwithstanding, just about 0.01% of food that is available for human consumption is actually redistributed in the UK. Let that sink in. So we have a lot of surplus food that is going to waste that could go to feed human beings. Okay, and so that is what we are hoping to then look at and see what are the issues there, what are the challenges, and how can we improve this to ensure that we can have better adherence to the food waste hierarchy, that more of the food do not bypass redistribution for human consumption into going to waste, going to animal feed, or even anaerobic digestion. Okay. To do that, we thought it important to go through supply chain mapping. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but we mostly understand the utility of supply chain mapping in terms of its ability to increase visibility, and has been used over time to help address issues around risk management, supply chain, sustainability, resilience, and performance improvement, and all of that. And there are, various ways we can approach this, from relationship-based and activity-based. But more specifically, within the food supply chain, several years ago, in fact, in the early 2000s, the British government, through DEFRA, worked with Cardiff University to develop a methodology that was useful in properly mapping out the food supply chain, analyzing it and identifying relevant issues in there to address some of the issues or challenges that we're facing in those times. So they came up with the food value chain analysis, which is FVCA. And it was a combination of lean principles, value stream mapping, and value chain analysis. And ultimately, it had these various steps through which the actors or the researchers would engage actors within the food supply chain and come up through workshops and several meetings with how the supply chain looks like, the various processes that are involved in it, the places of waste that can be eliminated, because mind you, the goal here was to improve efficiency and take out waste. So this is an established methodology, but that is not a method that is entirely required to go through all those steps for our purposes. And there have been several research, including Kuma et al., which adopted a similar approach, but not in as much detail, because not all the details are relevant for our purposes. So for us, first, we wanted to collect secondary data to map out what the basic food supply chain in the UK looks like, right, through the available literature and reports. And then based on that, having identified actors in the food supply chain, now conduct interviews to collect primary data and then create the big picture and see what the linkages are, what the issues are therein, you know, through our interviews, collect data on the challenges, potential solutions, the processes, and all of that, and come up with solutions. So that's exactly what we did. So we ended up speaking to about 32 senior managers and industrial experts and academic professionals in the industry and all of that, trying to get a better understanding of how things should be. And then obviously we went on to analyze the data through qualitative data analysis and Vivo under the various themes, use matrix coding to pull out the relevant data amongst most of the useful themes that came out of our work. And what we ended up finding was that, like everybody else, the person who may be considered disadvantaged, and like I highlighted earlier on, maybe a few more of us are even falling into this category than we may want to admit because of current ongoing crisis. And so the disadvantaged consumer, like every other consumer, also access some of their food through the traditional commercial food supply chain, right, through the hospitality and food service outlets, as well as through retailers. But in addition to that, depending on how much marginalized or disadvantaged a person might be, they also access their food through the food aid supply chain. All right. So in that case, these actors within the traditional food supply chain act as donors to send their food either through organizations that we call food aid wholesale distributors, right, like the Fair Shares, the Sophias and Co, and others too that the donors access directly, usually when the food charities, those we call food aid service organizations, who are the organizations where the disadvantaged access food directly from, and it could be schools, it could be food banks, it could be community cafes and all of those such organizations. And they may access the food directly through the donors within the supply chain. So what we came to find out then that was that the supply chain that serves disadvantaged communities is actually a hybrid food supply chain, right? Which is a conflux between the traditional commercial food supply chain and then the food aid supply chain, with the actors within the commercial food supply chain being the donors in there. The major issues that were highlighted, obviously, was that disadvantaged groups are generally an afterthought. Nobody within the well, not many of the actors that we spoke to had disadvantaged groups necessarily as one of their highlighted and most important actors that are considered within their day-to-day operations. Okay, so access to food was essentially through redistribution. So like I said, originally we didn't set out to explore the redistribution route at all, but we had to go there because it became obvious that that was the means through which food is redistributed to these persons that we are looking at. And if hypothetically we could have a supply chain which was extremely optimized to ensure that there was no surplus or waste food, then there was not going to be any food that was available for redistribution to these persons. And so access to food would have become a problem. I mean, it still is, but it would have been significantly a worse situation, right? So we do find out these food donors, actors in the supply chain, then send their food, which may be donated or discounted, given to them at cost, to these food aid wholesale distributors, who then distribute it onwards to the smaller charities to deliver it locally. We also found out that the existing food aid supply chain, as you had indicated there, is incapable of handling all of the surplus food. So one of the reasons why we saw previously that just 0.01% of food available for human consumption ends up being redistributed, right? And this mainly comes down to the limited capacity of the food aid service organizations, who basically are the food charities, the schools, the community cafes, and these outlets that people could go directly to access food, right? So the bottleneck within that supply chain are these organizations, and the operations are not formalized at all, typically rely on social media contact, phone calls, and that food supply chain actually also operates a push model. So obviously it is what donors have that they can give, and it is not, and so the consumers at the end do not seem to have much control over what gets donated to them at the end of the day, which is a little bit different from the situation where a customer going through the normal commercial food supply chain goes there to demand for what they want. And that is what drives the activities up the food supply chain. So these were some of our major findings. And in terms of challenges, we found, trust me, we found a lot of challenges, but we decided for the purpose of our presentation to focus on just a few of them so that we will look at them and see how we can maneuver around them. One of the biggest ones that we came across was issues around logistics and associated costs. So what you find within that food supply chain is that there are several actors, usually the big organizations, the big food manufacturers and the big retailers do not necessarily have a problem with themselves footing the cost, the logistic cost of sending their food to the food aid wholesale distributors and even the food charities as well, the food aid service organizations. But for donors like farmers and the relatively smaller actors in the supply chain, or those who operate on very slim margins, having the associated costs, the additional cost of having to harvest food. So imagine yourself as a farmer who's already operating on very thin margins because of how the food supply chain is structured, with all the power concentrated on the food manufacturers and especially the retailers. And then you have surplus food, maybe you've harvested more than you originally planned. Perhaps the weather was excellent, or you just couldn't properly forecast for the demand that you were given. And then you have this extra food, you want to give it out for charity. And now you have to make extra investments to harvest that food, package it, and then transport it to a food charity. A lot of people are not necessarily encouraged or interested in putting that extra bill. So that was one of the major things that was highlighted. And this was consistent across the whole food supply chain, even amongst the companies that were willing to afford it. It was an additional cost, which could be avoided if they were redirecting their food, bypassing the food redistribution to send it to, for instance, animal feed or anaerobic digestion. And these actors, because they are commercial in nature, actually pay the actors in the food supply chain to deliver these things for them, or they themselves come to collect these food and stuff like that. So that definitely was one of the issues. And that then translates into the next point in terms of the lack of economic incentives, right? If I have to invest all of this and spend all this money to ensure that food is redistributed, whereas I can bypass food distribution and send the food out to someone who is doing anaerobic digestion, or it's sending the food for animal feed, then I am encouraged to go through that route, right? And this is observed both amongst the donors as well as within the charity organizations who are doing the wholesale redistribution, as well as those who are at the consumer facing end trying to redistribute. Sometimes they struggle with getting access to funds, don't even understand the processes, sometimes think that the government is being unfair to them in the distribution of available funds to help with redistribution and all of that. And then there's severe lack of expertise, resources, and capacity, again, in the food aid supply chain sector, because they rely heavily on volunteers. Right. And so there's not enough expertise there to properly manage that supply chain to ensure that it is efficient. And so you realize that there's a lot of wastage in there, a lot of, repeated actions, little consolidation of efforts. People don't know what they are doing. Is largely because they are doing it out of a good heart, which is good. But on the flip side, there is a lot of waste and lack of resources there. And finally, one of the other very important points that we also came across was that disjointedness in the food aid supply chain. Again, particularly when you're looking at the food aid service organization end, where you could have multiple charities within the same community doing almost the same thing, but have no idea about each other, right? So there is repeated efforts, both of them trying to compete almost for the same resources which may be available from their local supermarkets and stuff like that. And all of these are detrimental to the sustainability of the work they are doing and the effectiveness at the end of the day. So because our research is focused on co-producing solutions, we also spoke with these same actors and asked their thoughts on how can we address some of these issues that we have identified with you, and how do you think these things will work? Because they are the ones who are involved in it, and having spoken with all of the various actors and looked at the various issues that were in there, some of the major issues that were pointed out to us was the need for better collaboration within the supply chains. And in my next slide, I'll show you how this reviews themselves across the various, for the food redistributors, as well as those who donate food. But there was the need for better collaboration, improved operational efficiency, increased economic incentives, however that will manifest itself for the various actors, and then improved livelihood and support systems for the disadvantaged communities so that they may not be disadvantaged after all, and may be able to access food, much more of their food, through the normal supply chain, as it were, right, that everybody else uses. And we also thought that it was important that there needs to be a lot more education, training, and awareness creation amongst actors in the food supply chain, the food aid distributors themselves, and in the community in general, because there are a lot of actors within the food supply chain who could be in a position to actually redistribute their food, but they don't know how to go about that. They don't know who to speak to or who to send their food to, and all of that. So these are some of the issues that came up. And like I pointed out, this manifests itself a little bit different across the food supply chain. Because of our time, I may not be able to go into a lot of specific details explaining everything. But one of the main points that we realized, for instance, is the critical role that logistics companies could actually play in addressing this issue, both in terms of the improved operational efficiency for both food distributors and food donors, as well as ensuring better collaboration amongst these actors. It is also important to point out the role that the media could play in ensuring this awareness creation and information sharing that we point out as important. Again, we'll quickly zoom into each of these ones and look at what the issues there are. But at the center of everything is the government, who will have to take the lead in doing all of this. We do have to acknowledge that this very project we are doing is sponsored by the government, and so there are initial actions taken, but with our research having identified these relevant actions that can be taken, they occupy the central role to ensure the collaboration and bringing together of the various actors to look at these points that have been raised, to test out initial solutions and ensure that things get done. But zooming in into the specifics, we can see for food distributors, for instance, that surplus food can actually be accessed further up the food supply chain. So for a good number of the food aid service organizations, they would access their food through the retailers. And usually that may come through, a variety of challenges. The food might be already packaged in smaller quantities. So a lot of man hours through the volunteers who are already short on time, used in just opening up small packs of food and bringing them together to all of that, which is very inefficient. And they could also exploit industry experience, taking away waste activities and delays, like I pointed out, and consolidation of their distribution and logistic hubs to work together to ensure that they make better use of the available space and all of that. On the part of food donors, there could be better visibility and streamlined decision-making. One of the issues that was highlighted for us here, for instance, was how organizations were relatively more reluctant, right, to send off food that have been marked as too near to their use-by date for them to send on to sell, right? So if you're a food manufacturer, you have your food stored somewhere in your warehouse, your logistics company, which handles that for you, sends you the information out to you that we have this many pallets of food that are very near to their use-by date, so we can't send them to the retailers to sell, because that's the agreement. They have a limit to when the latest that they can send their food to the retailers, right? But because of the technicalities involved there and the movement, because such food would affect their balance sheets, you get it. And so decisions around saying that, okay, send that food on for food distribution tends to get delayed. And by the time they are ready to redistribute that food, it is very close to the use-by date or the expiry date, and that presents a problem. So improving the visibility around the operations there and streamlining decisions in that area could be very, very important. Then we can think about the next point around improving collaboration amongst actors, where they could come together. The smaller charities can actually come together to bid for funds together, right, and put their talents together, because both of maybe 2 or 3 of us may not all have the relevant skills, but if one of us, or we could even come together and with some of our funds employ one logistics expert who would work for all of us, that may be a way to get around some of the challenges involved in with the limited talent in there. And just basic coming together to form umbrella groups would work together to push their goals forward. On the part of the redistributors here, I would just quickly mention them. The retailers being the most powerful actors in the food supply chain can push better collaboration in the commercial food supply chain. They can put together the redistribution of their food instead of each of them individually sending their food on to redistributors, which can be costly. Knowledge sharing, provision of expertise to redistributors, and all of that. On the part of ensuring that there is increased economic incentives, they can actually ensure a discounted, if government could intervene in ensuring that distribution costs may be discounted for them, or if we can think about better ways of engaging logistic companies as well as food donors to ensure that the costs are brought down, and consolidated efforts across the various retailers that they work for, right, to ensure that the food distributed is done at a lower cost, that will be important. Easier access to education and all of those things are things that might be important to do. For those actors within the food supply chain who are not easily, do not have the monies to afford to harvest their food and send it to food charities, can the food be bought at cost, right? Sometimes if you can pay for the cost of harvesting the food, packaging it and sending it off, the companies are more than willing to do it. So how do we approach that, right, to address some of those challenges? Providing tax reliefs or reprieves for companies to incentivize adherence to the food waste hierarchy and cost recovery for low-end food redistributors. Improved livelihoods, I think we are quite understandable. There are quite some interesting points here around the role that farmers, for instance, could play in bridging the gap in joblessness in some of the disadvantaged communities and the work that they do. But that requires a little bit more thinking on how to do it in such a way that they are not exploited and all of that. But there are opportunities there that indeed can be exploited. And in terms of education, training the food aid service organizations on proper benchmarked food redistribution operations, right? And showing the impact of the work that the donors do. Sometimes retailers get a lot of backlash of their role in food redistribution and stuff like that. But I have first-hand knowledge of how some of the biggest retailers in the country are doing an excellent job in supporting some of these organizations, but they can't come and blow their own horn, as it were. And the charities too are not doing a particularly brilliant job in showing forth the work that they do. So one way we can think about this is that instead of shaming, we could praise actually those who are doing a great job to bring more people in to do similar work as they would see their colleagues and others do. And lastly, we can also increase awareness amongst the actors in the food supply chain to understand that there are opportunities for redistribution and that the situation in the UK is as dire as it could ever be. In case we are not aware, we have a lot of people who are not having enough food to eat, good, healthy options, and that we can do a better job in ensuring that we get them access to food. And it's something that is important, and they can do something about it. There are already actors there that can help support these activities. And so that is something that we ought to be interested in, invested in, and ensure that we do what is needed to ensure that we have more of our people having good access to food. Now, going forward, we're hoping to do, in fact, we have started, that is what we are doing at the moment. We are doing the local food supply chain mapping for the 4 communities I mentioned on my very first slide, right? So I'm speaking with people locally in Plymouth, in Tower Hamlets. Well, the work in Tower Hamlets is yet to start, but I'm already speaking with people in Plymouth, in Brighton and Hove, and in Whitley and Reading, collecting data, understanding their issues, and how to improve those food supply chains for the relevant communities that we are looking at. How can we include Industry 4.0 and the lessons from there in ensuring a better optimized and even resilient food redistribution scheme? How can we use blockchain, for instance, to help increase the visibility that we are looking at? How can we use drone technology and robotics or any of these others to make things easier and better improved in redistributing food? Because even though the more long-term sustainable solution is to ensure that there are no disadvantaged communities in the first place, so that everybody can access food through the traditional food supply chains. We still have just too much of our food going waste, too much of our food being thrown away that can be redistributed. And so there is the need to invest in the short to medium term into how we can properly redistribute the food so that good food does not get thrown away as it currently is. And ultimately, we'll look at developing new food supply chains that deliver the attractive, healthy, affordable, accessible, and sustainable food options for disadvantaged communities. So that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I hope you got some questions to shoot at me and we can discuss them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for that. I think it was you were spot on with the time. I think you gave us a lot of time and give us a lot of food for thought. Really, it was a very interesting and very nice slides as well. The video, I really enjoyed it. It got me thinking. Great. So thank you so much. Very informative, very engaging, very interesting, and like I said, very, very apt. But before we progress, or I don't want to ask questions now, but I think we'll leave it to the audience participants to ask questions. Any questions you have for Emmanuel? I can see PKK has a question for you. So over to you, PKK.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmanuel, for your presentation. That was insightful, and I think I am currently actually my research area is in line with what you've done, but I am going to add the technology aspect of it. I'm looking at machine learning and artificial intelligence in solving the food insecurity, basically. So I think it was good I joined this presentation. But aside of the future learning, I didn't see anything on the role of the university in solving the issue, because I realized that your focus was on government, which is the main, and the other one is the supplier also. But what role is the university going to do to help salvage this situation? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. You're right. Indeed, we as part of our research, there is information that we gathered around the role that universities can play in it. But then again, like I said, when you code data and you come up with the final information, you may have to put various priorities as it were, to the actions that can be done. But indeed, you're right. The universities have a lot of role to play in this, part of which is what we are already doing the relevant research into the area, finding out what the issues are and how to bridge the gap, right, with industry. And in fact, one of the very important roles that we can play is, number one, showing government what to do, again, which is what we are trying to do here, to expose them to what the issue is, play the central role in bringing the various actors together to look at the problem together, and so that everybody listens to each other, right? So there have been talks around these things. There are some forms of activities which are put together to ensure some levels of collaboration. But we think, and when I say we in Cranfield at the moment are indeed looking at ways where we can bring together various actors in the food supply chain that we spoke to, all sit down and look at these things together. So these are the issues. How do we think we can go forward addressing these issues to ensure that we have a better, more efficient system, we better redistribute our food and all of that? So yes, the university's role is to do more research, identify who the solutions that we put together to, what are the trade-offs that can be done there, who are the winners and the losers, who are going to benefit from the solutions we propose, and who are going to lose out. How do you compensate those who lose out? All of these are opportunities for future research. So definitely, we have a role in doing further research and bringing together to actually activate our research findings into proper solutions that make good impact.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emmanuel, for that, and thanks, PKK.
Thank you so much. Anyway, this is Paul. I had to change from my phone to the laptop. That is why you have the
okay.
PKK.
Yeah, I guess it was Paul, because I don't want to assume, because I know that Paul was in before.
Yeah.
And he became PKK. So thanks, Paul.
Okay.
And I'm glad that you're doing similar research with
Yeah.
Dr. Sawyer. And
Yeah.
this is like what Emmanuel said. This is the research is funded by the government, and of course, the government is already doing something by reaching out to academics like Emmanuel and other people in Cranfield to see how they can solve this very important problem that we are currently facing. One of the things I really liked about Emmanuel's presentation is that there's already a model, and you can see the link between what the government has to do, what the media need to do. Starting with the media, really, I think the media has a very strong part to play. If you look at what happened with Rashford, you would argue that the media really helped and pushed that rhetoric. Without the media, what Rashford was trying to do would not have been achieved. And it still falls back to what Dr. Sawyer has been trying to point out, how we can ensure we can redistribute this or ensure that we can get it from 0.01%, isn't it, Emmanuel, to something higher. Well, thanks so much, Emmanuel, for that. Any questions for Emmanuel? Okay, Nicolo.
Hi, Emmanuel, and first of all, thank you so much for the very insightful presentation. I am Italian. I'm living in Texas right now in the United States, so I was not aware of all these things that are going on in the UK. And something that got particularly my attention was the fact that you mentioned the Industry 4.0 and how the blockchain will be able to help to solve, at least in part, all these problems. And I was curious to have probably a more thorough, more deeper opinion of yourself on how this, for example, the blockchain first, starting from it can help the all these problems for these communities in England.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think the first point to make was the fact that we wanted to highlight that there are opportunities to use blockchain in here, and it is indeed an opportunity. Well, before even I finish answering, Paul, you can get in touch later on if you are interested, so that we can talk a little bit more about your work, right? And
Okay. Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
to
That's fine, Dr.
everybody
Sawyer.
else. Yes, yes.
That's
so
right. That's fine.
that'll be fine. And to get specifically to your question, Nicolo. So yes, we understand the utility of blockchain, for instance, in creating visibility and help improve decision making in supply chain management. So for instance, in the food supply chain at the moment, for traceability is a huge deal, and there are a lot of retailers. Carrefour in France is one of those ones who have implemented blockchain technology along with IBM Cloud to allow their food to be traced all the way to farmers. When you pick the product, you can look at all the relevant details about where the food is coming from and all of that. But that's not what I'm referring to at the moment. But the point I was trying to make here is utility in ensuring visibility within the supply chain, right? And we could do the same thing within the food supply chain in terms of redistribution, because one of the biggest issues for the food donors is that they do not know where their food is going. Even though it's good for them to donate their food, they also don't want a situation whereby their food gets taken somewhere else, gets sold at a cheaper price, and then turns out to be a competition for them. Okay, so we think that could be one of the important roles that it could play there. It could also help ensure that there's a proper management of the whole redistributing system, because at the moment it is very haphazard. There are some apps, right, that are working to ensure that there is like you get notified. There's Neighborly, there's there are a couple of others that are escaping me right now that just notify you that there's food at this place. You can go there to collect it, but it's not as efficient, and it could be better, for instance, if we have blockchain underlying some of these technologies and all of that. So yeah, I do think that there are opportunities that could be exploited through blockchain technology, but like I pointed out, further research could even exploit this further to see how we can expedite this even more.
Very interesting. And considering the effect of visibility, on transparency, I've been living in Italy for 22 years, and I realized that, for example, grocery stores throw away a lot of food, and to avoid having scenarios like the one you showed in the video at the very beginning of the presentation, which is incredibly awful. Have you ever considered, like, for example, leveraging the blockchain for transparency by probably gamifying the waste of food, like, for example, creating a kind of a genuine competition among like, for example, grocery stores or food deliveries, that they say, well, right, we have this food, rather than throwing it away, because nobody's buying it and it's about to expire, rather than let it expire and waste it, we can donate it. And this donation can be recorded on the blockchain, and all the competitors and the people outside, for example, even me, you, or whoever, can see which grocery store is donating more food. This can be interesting, creating a genuine competition.
Absolutely, you're right. And like I pointed out, the more we think about this, the more we see how we could actually exploit some of these things. Because like I said, one of the challenges you identify is how some of the actors within the food supply chain, the retailers in particular, are doing an excellent job redistributing a lot of their food, but they can't blow their own horn. But if you're using blockchain and it is there for us all to see, for the access in the media, in case they have access to it, to also see it, then it is there for everybody to see, and it can create the competition that you highlight. So very much so, there is room for that. I see a few other hands. Christian, call out.
Yeah, I think Nicolo, thank you so much. Nicola, are you okay with Emmanuel's responses? Or you want to ask more questions? Are you okay with that?
Oh, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. Perfectly.
Okay, no problem. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, as well. I think the next person is Alan.
Yes, hi there, Emmanuel. Firstly, many thanks for that very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I'm a lecturer here at UWS, and I actually have supervised a number of dissertations. I notice you're a former student on logistics, the MSc, logistics and supply chain management. So I've supervised a number of dissertations, and also with our MBA students on the London campus. And yeah, the reason I was going to focus on was I formerly worked in industry, and I see a fantastic opportunity here now, obviously with government, but with the private sector, to transition over and bring some of these skills, through staffing teams, whether it be through volunteer programs or whether it be through a government alliance. Because I think some of these issues, specifically the bottleneck that you highlighted, that's a very traditional manufacturing type of issue. And if the expertise could be deployed into the food distributors and to help these charities who, as you say, Emmanuel, they do not have the resources, they do not have the knowledge, they do not have the capacity. And I'm thinking, like, you're focusing on 4 areas down in England, the South Coast, and we know this is a UK-wide issue, but surely the networks are not so overrun that we couldn't get that expertise over to take some of the pressures and stresses away from the charity who want to focus on their client group, who may just not have the wherewithal to understand processes. And it would be an incredible opportunity for an organisation or a group of organisations to actually get proactively involved. Because when I seen your statistic, the 56.7 surplus food versus, as Dr. Christian said there, the 0.01% that's actually reaching the people that require it, it's actually heartbreaking to think. And we know that going on, the cost of living crisis is continuing every morning, every day. We hear it on the news or we read about it online, and the problem is growing. And obviously the food, the organisations who are helping, they don't want to blow their own trumpet, as you say, the very good retailers, they need help also for coordination. And I just see, I don't know how you feel about it, but a bottleneck issue could get a group of people in conjunction with the government not get together and actually drive this through to solution and alleviate the pressures and stresses in the system. It's more a general point I'm making, but I don't know how you feel about that, Emmanuel.
I totally agree with you, Alan. And like we were pointing out there, we'll have to have some concurrent solutions at the same time, right? Because one of the biggest issues, even when the private sector are willing to provide some support for the charities, they are so disjointed that it makes it difficult for it to be properly planned and rolled out. So a way to go about it, for instance, is to ensure that we have some improved visibility for these charities and some level of association, not anything boggling that is creating some tensions. Because as part of the research, I did find out among some of the food banks, for instance, there are different philosophies, and they compete and fight over some of these things. We can have a very loose association as a way that can collaborate with the private sector, where experts in the private sector can volunteer for maybe a week in the year, just spend some time to train the volunteers or the few permanent actors in the food in the food charity sector to ensure that we are improving upon their skills and all of that. I definitely agree with you. The opportunities to address some of these issues, and it all comes down to, start with the work we have done and proceeding to engage the relevant actors, which we are hoping to do actually in next year, bring together some of these actors. Let us start talking about it and move further beyond the desk research and collecting the data and all of that into ensuring that some of these findings are translated into actionable points that translate into the lives of people. So thank you very much, and I do agree with you.
No, thank you. And I think that you have the framework there and all the fantastic work you have done at Cranfield. And, there's people like Professor Richard Wilding as well, running around Cranfield. There's people who have the links with industry that could make this happen. But I totally agree about the coordination and also the different conflicts that can occur at a local level with the different stresses. But, let's be optimistic that this can be driven forward now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I like the way Alan ends this. Listen, let's be optimistic, and I believe I'm an optimist, and I believe that that's the reason why Emmanuel is doing it, and that's why the government is also funding it as well, so that we can change the narrative, and hopefully we'll be able to see how we can map the food supply chain better. One of the things that I know Emmanuel was very, very humble about, and I told him I was going to say it. So I'm going to say it now. When Emmanuel was on the program several years ago, he was the valedictorian. He was the best graduating student of that same MSc program. So he's a very, very smart alumnus of our university. So well done. Either way, the next person is Pierre Lena.
Yeah. Hi, Christian. Hi, Emmanuel. This is Perlina, and I'm doing my doctorate in the business studies here at UWS in Scotland. I'm not particularly a logistics student, but having had corporate experience in that, I am more interested in the educational sector. So I went through your program and it was very interesting, I should say. But I'm more curious to know from the university's perspective or from the educational perspective, how much of the findings that you gain through this, do you think we could add into the curriculum of the MSc Logistics program? How much of it can be educated within schools on wastage? Because I know we speak a lot about blockchain, Industry 4.0, all that is good going, but we have to somewhere inject it into our culture as to how much of food actually gets wasted. Now, I come from a country like India. Now, your information was a shocker to me. I never knew so much of wastage happens in the UK. And I'm sure there are many folks like me naive of the fact that countries like UK, USA, as we call them to be well-developed countries, would never have this problem or crisis situation at all. So somewhere we need to give this into our children in schools, and somewhere we need to create a model within the higher education so that, people get serious about stuff like this, because supply chain management right now has its own crisis, global crisis, economic crisis, and we are going to see many of it come through in the near future. So I just wanted to get your insight into that to see if you have that kind of overall plan to get this into the curriculum at some point. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very, very much. First, I must confess that I have not thought about the incorporation of this directly into, say, the master's level yet, because I as you mentioned it, I do think about how we may be able to approach it. And to be fair, I did highlight in one of my master's dissertation propositions that were of some of the students who just finished. Right, it was one of the things I got them to research into around food waste and all of that. But notwithstanding, not anything affecting everybody else. So that is something that we have to think about a little bit further to see how we can get that one done. But definitely at a grassroots level, in terms of primary school and all of that, it is something that came up. And I spoke with actors, farmers, and some other actors in the food supply chain who are already engaging with schools to teach them some of these issues. But it is not necessarily official. It's more of a voluntary work that they are doing. So we do have to think a little bit further about this. And thanks for pointing this out. It is something that we need to really look at and see how do we get everybody right from schools. In fact, perhaps even bringing back cooking of food, because it's one of the biggest issues here that people lack cooking skills. And even though it might not be at the core of the whole problem, it is a contributing factor whereby very edible food, for instance, one of the other findings that we're having is that in the coastal towns in the UK, in the UK overall, a lot of the fish that are caught in our seas are not consumed within the UK. They are exported, and most of the food that most of the fish that we eat are imported, which is a problem, right? And so part of this issue is that even if you were able to get the local actors at the beaches and in the coastal towns to deliver their locally landed fish to the people, they don't know what to do with them. Right. And so, yes, I totally agree with you. Some of these issues are points that we need to look closely at and make sure that we address them. But I do confess I had not thought about it as far as that. And it is something I'm going to consider with Professor Bolakis, think further about it and see how we can also approach it from that angle as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paulina, for that. It's a good one, isn't it? Trying to see how you can incorporate it into the curriculum. I know Emmanuel mentioned that we need to encourage people to cook and all that. I think there's a place for that in the college. So the college, they have their HNCs and all that. But the truth is, we know that we want people to come to university. So it's important that we also see how we can attract people within that space as well. So it's great to see how we can put it and incorporate it into our curriculum and the findings you have. And of course, it's going to be great for Cranfield to start and maybe bring it to UWS as well. And let's see how we can replicate that. But good one, Paulina. And we have Paul.
Yes, hey, I'm back again. I have two concerns. The first one is it possible to solve this food wastage? Is it possible to institute a award system since the government is the one sponsoring? So at least the higher charitable donator can get some kind of a scheme, awarding scheme, so at least they will be appreciated for doing more. Then without everybody be challenged to go and do it. Although your focus is to ensure that there's an adequate supply, but the issue is would they supply on time so that they will not have the wastage. Then secondly, could this wastage be of the view that maybe the beneficiaries are not interested in the food that are being supplied? Is there, as part of the supply chain, is there a need assessment to know the actual needs of the population that are going to be supplied the food? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, once again for your couple of questions. Looking at the first one, I do agree with you. I think that, like we highlighted, incentivization is a very important aspect of this work that we need to do. And as you may have noticed there, not only are we pushing for an economic incentivization in terms of tax reprieves for those who may be shown to be the strongest actors in redistribution or whatever other means that the government can look at in using to incentivize actors, but also getting social incentivization, right? To tell the whole world, to tell the public that this, when you go to that retailer or when you buy the product of that food manufacturer, or when you do this and that, you are contributing to an organization who cares about the community and is supporting them in this way or in that way. And like you point out, if on top of that, we want to do something like some certification or some form of endorsement to highlight some of the impacts or interventions that they are doing, absolutely, it is something that can be explored further. But the underlying point is that incentivization is an important thing that ought to be done, not only from the economic perspective, but in terms of also, social currency and showing themselves as part of their work in the communities their ESGs and the CSRs and whatever approach that they want to adopt in helping make good impact within the community. On the last point that you made around the food options for the communities, it's a tricky one. Not because it's not undoable, but it depends on a variety of factors. So firstly, I think the point that we clearly made there is that it is what people have that they give. And the current scheme relies quite heavily on donations, right? And so that's how come we pointed out how that food supply chain is a push system, where it is what people have that they push through. But in addition to that, there is a relatively small aspect of it where the actors or the food redistributors do purchase food at cost from the food donors, right? So that they are able to balance out the service offering that they are giving to people who come to access their food. So most of the time, what they do get is a good variety of food, but what we can't ensure is consistency of a particular type of food all the time, which is a problem. And the other approach is at the very food aid service organization level, where depending on the model that is being operated, some organizations operate this situation where it's a food bank, you can access them only a number of times. You don't really have much of a say in what is given to you as a donation or is delivered to your doorstep for those who operate that model. But there are also those who operate from the social enterprise perspective, where they have sort of a community cafe or a social retailer outlet where whoever it is may walk into the shop and pick whatever they want. You get it? So that could also be a way to looking at a push, hopefully away from the traditional food bank model, even though that is also important, must still be there concurrently, but moving more towards a more social retailer angle, where not only are people going to come through to, and usually in such circumstances, not that they come and pay a lot of money. Sometimes it's just a membership model where every month they pay a few pennies, or you walk in and if you put two pounds down, you can have access to the equivalent of, say, 20 pounds or 50 pounds worth of food, right? So it's not necessarily a profit-making venture, but it gives people respect. It gives them autonomy and choice over the food that they select and all of that. So it is a complex combination of a variety of issues where we are looking at the model being operated at the consumer-facing end, as well as the issues around the donation scheme that is currently the most predominant means out there, where you can't really get people donating food that might not be might not have shifted into the what's the word to use, closer to their use by date, that are easier to distribute. But again, once we start thinking about some of these issues, we can see if we can get to incentivize people to give the food that would typically not tend to get donated. So yeah, it is a complex issue, but I think it's still very much solvable. I hope that clarifies it for you, Paul.
Yes, please. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul, for the questions, and of course, thanks, Emmanuel, for the apt answers and informative answers. Like the discussion is going. Do we have any other questions for Dr. Sawyerr? Any other questions for Emmanuel? Anything you want to ask? Anything you want to add? Okay, if there are no more questions, I would try to, because Paul, your hands are still up. Is it a legacy hand, or do you want to ask another question? I think it's a legacy one.
No. I'm taking it off.
Okay, no problem. I just don't want to know whether you're going to ask any other question. If we don't have further, Nicola, do you want to ask any questions? No. Okay. So if we don't have further questions, thank you so much for this. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks especially to Dr. Sawyerr for joining us here today. This research is apt, it's apposite, and I'm so happy that the government is really pushing this. Most of the time, we tend to say the government is not doing a lot, but in this case, we know that the government is doing something. And of course, they have put it in the hands of Emmanuel and his team. And it's great to see this model in place. And hopefully, like Emmanuel rightly pointed out, we'll get the relevant stakeholders and they'll be able to push this and we'll be able to see how this goes. But it's very insightful, like Nicholas said, highly insightful call. Thank you everyone for organizing and presenting. So thank you so much. On behalf of the school, I'd like to say thank you to everybody that attended. And of course, hope in the next 2 weeks, we have another seminar of this nature, and we would like you definitely to be here. That is almost, because really for this month, we're looking at the cost of living and the crisis. So we're looking at trickle-down economics from Professor John Strutters. What does that mean? How can we align with that? Are we in the right place? So please make sure you don't miss that. But on behalf of I and the school, I'd like to say thank you and see you in the next seminar. So thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Good luck now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.